My name's Robert Samuels. I'm the co-author of His Name Is George Floyd, One Man's Life and the Struggle for Racial Justice. I co-authored the book with my colleague at the Washington Post, Tolu Olorunipa. Tolu is the new father to a bouncing baby boy, so I'm taking the lead on a number of these discussions. First of all, thank you for allowing me into this family. I feel the work that you do is so inspiring and so moving. And I had a little trouble thinking about what I can say to folks who have inspired me. And when I thought about it, I thought about telling you a little bit about how I got into reporting and learning about the life of George Floyd, why we did it, and the lessons that we drew from it. Now, to be honest, the story of how we started to learn about George Floyd happened when we thought we saw the incident that was going to define race conversations for the entire year. And that incident happened the day before George Floyd was murdered. It was between a bird watcher and a white woman walking her dog in Central Park. Does anyone remember this? Okay, cool. So Amy and Christian Cooper had this altercation in Central Park. And the day of the incident, I got into a pretty big argument with a friend from my high school. He was trying to explain to me that legally, Amy Cooper did nothing wrong when she called the police on this man. And this infuriated me. And I tried to explain rather poorly that the law itself cannot be the arbiter of morality, especially when it comes to issues around race. And I tried to say how easy it was to hide behind the veil of nuance, playing the devil's advocate, while ignoring the lived, real pain of people. And then I told him that if a cop killed me tomorrow, my biggest worry would be that the first questions about my life would be, what did he do to deserve it? They wouldn't be about my hopes and dreams, who I loved, what I meant to people. And I stayed home that evening, but a man named George Floyd, who lived in Minneapolis, took his friend Maurice Hall to a place called Cup Foods because he wanted to buy a refurbished laptop computer. And what we saw on that day ended up changing the world, or so it seemed rather briefly. And to be honest, as a journalist who had covered Newtown, Ferguson, Dallas, Baltimore, my first instinct was to stay away from this story because I thought I had known how it would go, that people would be upset for a couple weeks, something terrible would happen that would besmirch the name of George Floyd, and everyone would move on. Now, as I was avoiding this story, I got a call from my editor who said, "You cannot avoid this story. We're sending you out there." And what he was saying to me was, we're not going to cover George Floyd in the typical way. We're gonna think about how people can understand systemic racism. And then, as we were going through ideas, it came up that maybe the way to do it was to look at one person's life and have them navigate through all of these institutions over the course of their life. And our editor said, "I've been thinking about that, and I've been thinking if the right person to do this for is George Floyd." And that was the beginning of a journey, because I had known that there was something unique about the moment that we needed to capture, even though I tried to avoid it. And so we did a lot of things that seemed a little bit dangerous to do during the pandemic. I met with all 6 of George Floyd's siblings. We ate dinner with them. We went to church with them. We talked to them almost daily as they watched the trial of the man who murdered their brother. I got haircuts from George Floyd's barber. We walked the streets where he walked and sat in rehab sessions in the places where he tried to put his life together. We met his girlfriend who said she was the only person that George Floyd ever loved. We met another girlfriend who said that George Floyd is the only person she ever loved. We met a third person who said the same thing. We found eyewitnesses and talked to them about the day they watched him die. We went back 7 generations to look through his family history to discover a story about Black ownership, Black land loss, sharecropping. And then we spoke with super smart people who understood these systems. We talked with Mayor Jacob Frey, Governor Tim Walz, back when he was just Governor Tim Walz, Reverend Al Sharpton, Jesse Jackson. And our last interview came about a half hour before our deadline, which was with Joe Biden. Now, usually when I do these talks, I go through a lot more about George Floyd's life, but because of the occasion that we're meeting with each other today, I wanted to talk a little bit about why George Floyd, whose family was from North Carolina, ended up in Houston, Texas. His mom was a sharecropper. She wanted the city life to get a better life. And his mother, Larcenia, was the type who would say, you can speak the ghetto language, but you also have to learn to speak the King's English. She would give her kids impromptu spelling tests. And by the time George Floyd was in 2nd grade, he was actually reading and writing at grade level, which is an incredible achievement for people who are growing up in the abject poverty that the Floyd family was. And in 2nd grade, he wrote this essay about how he wanted to be a Supreme Court justice. Now, it's 2nd grade, so it's not long. It's about a paragraph. But he talks about the fact that he was inspired by Thurgood Marshall, who he had heard about. And he thought there would be nothing cooler to do than to administer the law. Now, in other settings, this would be a mark of brilliance. The words were spelled right, the grammar was right, the punctuation was right. But they saw George Floyd, who was a tall, fast man, and they told him, you know, people in our neighborhood, if they get out, they don't become lawyers. They learn to play football. And so instead of giving him more textbooks, they gave him a football because he was tall and he was fast, but he was not naturally gifted as an athlete. He learned that attribute because people told him that's what he needed to do. In fact, George Floyd's coach told us that he had to train George Floyd to be ruthless because if someone was charging at him, instead of dodging him, he would just toss the ball over to him. That's the type of person George Floyd was. So he builds up this body, 6'6", 225 pounds, and he gets this football scholarship, but then he learns some of the cruelties of systemic racism, right? Because he grew up in this educational system that said, don't study, and then when he got to college, he couldn't meet the educational requirements that he needed to play. So he ends up leaving college. And then he falls into the economics of his community, right? And that, in this community, would be drug use and drug sales. And he happens to be in a time during what we now know as the war on drugs or the war on crime. And although we know that Black people and white people used drugs in the same way, at the same rate, what our research showed was in Texas, where George Floyd was from, the number of white people who are arrested for drug-related crimes declined 9% during that time. If you're a Black man, those numbers went up 360%, right? So these police officers are in his community. He gets arrested for doing things like walking too quickly down the street. He gets arrested for things like walking too slowly down the street. And by the time he catches an assault charge, which to the end of his life he swore he did not do, he knew that accepting a plea deal was the best way to have a full life. It was 5 years versus 40 years. In Texas, a state that had no public defenders, and the lawyer who defended him would be appointed by a friend of the judge. It makes me wonder what would happen if he went to a prison and actually got a college education. Instead, what happened was he asked for mental health treatment, which he did not receive. They put him in remedial classes, even though he already had a high school diploma. And around his community, what the lawmakers were saying was, yes, we're putting more people in jail, but we're putting more money into things like mental health and rehab and boys and girls clubs. But when we looked at the data and we went back to those times in the early 90s and we looked through the federal allotments, which was supposed to be millions and millions of dollars, when you look at the allotments, $0 put in those programs. Now, when George Floyd actually comes out, he's living in a place where 1 in 3 jobs in Texas require a license, and as a felon, he's not able to get one. But he's out on the corner one day, and he sees a friend coming out of a really nice car, and the friend looks good. He's bigger than he used to be, eyes less jaundiced, and he starts telling him about a place called Minneapolis. And it turns out that there was this pipeline of people who had criminal records, who were his friends, who went to Minneapolis because they could get health insurance, and they had programs that could help heal them. But the thing that truly healed them was community. That they were with each other, that they held each other when they were down, that when they were sober, they celebrated and would take them out to Hooters. And during these periods, that was when George Floyd was the most vibrant. He was sober. He had a good job. He had 2 good jobs. He had a nice house. And then that leads to the pandemic, which is where we all need him. Now, when I tell this story, I often tell people that what I learned most is that I used to think of racism as the original sin in this country, right? This dark cloud that hung over us. But as I continued to see people moving to try to fight it, I learned that racism actually is a force. It lives and breathes with our history. And when we understand our history, we know that the only way to deal with systemic issues are to confront them after we acknowledge them. And when we understand our history, sometimes these incidents, like what happened to George Floyd, don't seem like they're isolated as much as they feel inevitable. It can leave us hopeless, feeling like we're sitting ducks just waiting for the next terrible thing to happen. But I often tell people that my work as a journalist often reifies my faith in humanity far more than it depletes it. Because I started this discussion by saying I did not want to learn about George Floyd. My instinct was to dismiss him, as so many people had done when they first heard about him or saw him on the street. But now look at how we know his name. And we know his name because of the beautiful and powerful resistance that I kept on seeing with people, largely Black people, who honored me with their time and filled pages with hopes for a better tomorrow and to inspire other people. And why we don't try not to get into his head, I think it's important to say that I don't think George Floyd would have considered his life tragic. He held on to the belief that one day this country would see him in his fullness and with all the nuance. Now, we saw some poems he used to write because he wrote them, and he would always say, man, life sucks, but life never, ever sucks, because each day there's something better to do. I think about women who I met, like Tashira Garraway, who told me, as long as we fight, there's still a chance. But if we don't fight, there's no chance. And I think about what my co-author Tolu told me one day when I had no idea why we were continuing to pursue this story. And he'd say, Robert, we have to do our part. The last words that people associate with George Floyd were, "I can't breathe." But if you knew him, the three words that people most associated with him were, "I love you." And that's why at the end of his life, you hear him saying, "Mama, I love you. Tell my kids, I love you. My friends, I love you." He was hoping people would be able to see him in the same way that he saw himself. It reminds me of this poem I knew in high school called "Yet Do I Marvel" by the poet Connie Cullen. And in the poem, Cullen says that he has no doubt that God is good, well-meaning, and kind. And he ends the poem by saying this: "Yet do I marvel at this curious thing, to make a person black and to bid him sing." And I think about at the end of his life, while he was saying "I love you" to people, that George Floyd still believed in the power of sing. And it's the opportunity that we have to take that power very seriously, to show that despite when things happen in the country that we don't agree with, that we still have the power of sing. He hoped someone would hear his cry, tell his story, keep going. And all around us, and people who supported him, joined him in trying to do their part. They carried a hope, an American hope, that can sometimes seem like a defense mechanism, because there's nothing to do but hope when the alternative is bleak. Pessimism is our ultimate American privilege, but our optimism lies in our American hope. It's a hope so often carried by people who should have little hope, many of whom deserve every praise for allowing us to tell our story, the people who've yet to fulfill the fullness of our American promise. It's a hope that's embedded in so many of the books we read, the reasons we write, why we continue to gather. It's the reason why we get up in the morning, and as long as we're able, it is the reason for us to continue doing the work. Thank you.